Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Light Path podcast. It's so nice to sit with you and to talk about something that I think is so important. And I don't think by memory I've actually talked that much about it on the podcast. And I'm definitely feeling like it's time to share and to really dive into an aspect of ourselves, of our psyche, and that is our shadow. So this really came up for me at a really recent full moon that we had, this full moon in Scorpio. And in this episode, I'm going to go in and be really vulnerable and share with you the stuff in my shadow that came up at this full moon that really sparked me to think deeply about how even though you might be on a path where you're really conscious and you're tapping away and doing the work, but the shadow can be so prevalent and so sneaky that it can actually be, without your conscious awareness a lot of the time, completely running the show, the script, and the production, not to mention the direction and the quality of your life. And this is almost going to be a little bit of a series, I guess, of chats, because I have connected a while ago with an amazing woman, Dana, who's actually going to be on the podcast a couple of times, and she's going to be talking a lot about the nervous system and specifically about shame. And I think shame is a huge aspect of our shadow that most of us spend a lot of time avoiding and not being in relationship with. But this chat for me is more, with me, is going to be more about how we look at our shadow and to be able to identify how it just might be dictating and directing a lot of what is going on in our lives. So first up, like, exactly what is the shadow self? Well, it's a term coined by a very famous psychologist, Carl Jung, and he referred to the shadow self as the unconscious part of our psyche that really contains all the aspects of ourselves that we do not want to look at. So it's the stuff about ourselves that we may consciously or subconsciously deny, the stuff about us that we repress, or the stuff that we just basically don't want other people to know it exists within us because we don't think it would be socially acceptable, or that we wouldn't be accepted in the fullness of who we are. So we push these parts of ourselves into, if you can imagine a room, into the shadow, into the corners, hide it under the bed, under the couch, whatever it is. And really, we know it's there, it lurks there, but we often do all we can not to look at it. But as you'll maybe see through this chat, or maybe you'll start to identify the ways in which we can't really hide anything. And a lot of the time, our choices or our thought processes are actually made all around how to keep the shadow hidden, as opposed to the freedom and flow of our true authentic selves and the empowerment that that comes with. So these shadow traits could include things like our anger, our envy, or maybe even how greedy we are. Our shadow self could also potentially be, talents that we have, or dreams and desires that we have, potentiality in our psyche or ourselves that we're really afraid to embrace because of that social acceptability, or maybe even personal responsibility that comes with these traits. And so this shadow aspect of ourselves, or the unconscious part of our personality, is not just traits, but it's also those deep, kind of uncomfortable emotions. A lot of these emotions are just deemed unattractive or unacceptable, but they exist. And often in societies, we're never really taught how to hold these emotions. We're never taught how to learn from them, ask what they need, and honor them. And so we just basically stuff them down. If you have ever done any shadow work with me or any other healer, you will know that actually when you peek under the couch, when you go and you basically shine a light on the shadow and bring it forth and simply sit with a shadow aspect of yourself, it is the most transformative and beautiful experience that you can have. And often the shadow experiences that I have had personally and with clients have been when we've just knocked on the door of the shadow and asked it to bring forward whatever it needs to release. So sometimes going in without a plan or an idea of what the shadow wishes to bring to the light, to soothe it, to heal it, to release it, is some of the most powerful transformative experiences that I have. And that is why in the spiritual community we say you always know, because you do always know. You know it's there, you just necessarily don't consciously look at it, and you're not consciously wanting to become aware of it, which makes it stuffed down into the shadow. So when we look at the shadow in an experience like a healing, it's a very guided, a very nurturing place. But I have to say that the most amazing thing about my main spiritual practice, which is working with the cycles of the moon, is that the full moon is a time traditionally when we say we release. But what we're really saying here is that the light of the moon is coming to shine its light or its spotlight on anything right now that may be hindering us, hurting us, or blocking us from really embracing our authenticity or truths or taking the next step in our lives. And I think it was the beautiful Wayne Dyer that used to use the analogy when he spoke to his audiences in his teachings, and he said, you know, when a room is dark and it's scary, the only way to remove darkness is to turn on the light. And essentially at a full moon every month, that is what we're doing. We're allowing that luminous time to basically light up the room so there can be no shadow. And we're forced willingly to face what it is that may have been lurking, that we couldn't face up until this point, that it wasn't appropriate to face up until this point, or maybe we didn't need to. And that's why working with these beautiful cycles allows us to focus on different aspects due to the planetary alignments and placements and all the other things that are going on in the skies. So recently in late April, so the 24th of April, we had a full moon in Scorpio. Now the energy, I'm not going to go into the energy of this particular moon. If you are a moon member, you will know exactly what it was all about. But ultimately it was an opportunity, because Scorpion energy is quite deep and dark, to go into the shadow. As someone who does this work all the time, it never ceases to amaze me how much is lurking in there. And what came out for me was really this realization of how much my shadow had completely taken over the show of my life. And so very vulnerably, I'm going to share with you a snippet of the journaling I did at the full moon in Scorpio. So at the time I wrote, I'm feeling really trapped and limited by the shackles of my circumstances, and it has left me completely dulled in a vortex without light. I feel really misaligned from my authenticity. My shadow has been in charge, keen to protect me against more experiences of what it knows to be inevitable. Rejection, failure, daggers in my back, inadequacy. Of course, none of this is true, and the light of the moon has illuminated this governing force, one that I reject. And I think when I sat in the energy, I really saw how much at that time in my life, my shadow was really making all the decisions, forming all the thoughts, and then ultimately conjuring up all the emotions that I was sitting in. And simply by bringing the light and shining it upon it, I was able to make a very conscious choice. Do I choose to believe it because it looks true, it feels true? Or do I make another choice and completely and utterly reject, but also heal it? So when we are working with the shadow, ultimately, we're looking at choices, thoughts, beliefs, patterns of behavior that really don't align with our really conscious and carefully thought out goals or values, aka the intentions that we set for ourselves at every new moon. So here's a few ways that the shadow self really could be governing your life or running the show of your life. So as you listen, maybe just reflect on where does that land with me? If you go into immediate rejection, no, that's not me, it's probably triggering. So just kind of sit gently with yourself as I talk through this. So a lot of shadow is created by unresolved trauma. So if we have experiences that are really painful in our past and they're buried into our subconscious, the shadow self might take that and drive us to avoid situations that are going to mimic or trigger those emotions that we once felt. And that is exactly what I was feeling at this full moon. As my diary said, it's keen to protect me against more experiences of what it knows to be inevitable. So my shadow is sitting there waiting for this trauma to happen to me again. And so every decision I may have been making or thought pattern I was holding or belief I was projecting into the world was actually based around being ready or to avoid the trauma or the emotions triggered by the trauma that I've had in the past. So avoidant behaviors, limiting opportunities that we could have for happiness or growth, even just complete and utter freeze and fawn kind of mode. And we'll get more into that. I'll get Dana next week to explain more of that in our nervous system. The other way a shadow can be really ruling your life and writing your story is through projection. And this is why self-observation can be very, very powerful, because when we're observing our thoughts or even our words and our actions, we're actually just learning the story of our shadow or subconscious self, as opposed to it being about anybody else. Everyone, in our life, people will say is a mirror. And I don't know if that's conclusively true, but it often feels true. And I think if you use that in a very empowering way, it can be actually very helpful for that to be true. So what is this person, or what am I noticing in this person or this situation, i.e. the mirror, that is illuminating truths about myself, whether they be triggers that I'm rejecting in that person? Am I rejecting that part in myself? Or are they showing me that, yes, I do know my values and boundaries and I choose a no to that? Is it showing me opportunities to be more? Is it inspiring? So other people can always act as that mirror. But in terms of projection, sometimes we do project our own insecurities and fears and really those traits that we talked about before of the shadow that we deem to be very undesirable onto others. So, for example, if we're feeling maybe inadequate, so that's one thing that I listed in my journal, that feeling of inadequacy was really coming up for me. So I had to look at like, well, how's that playing out? Like, and it could play out by projecting onto other people and calling them judgmental or critical or not worthy of what they were having, or the success or the happiness or whatever it is that they were having. And now I'm speaking through this, I can't actually remember how I projected this onto other people, but I'm sure I did within my thoughts for sure. And really that's just I'm feeling insecure about that. I'm feeling inadequate, and therefore it's very quick to project that judgment onto others. Another really obvious way that the shadow needs your love and attention and light is because it's running the show through the vehicle of self-sabotage. Now, who hasn't at one or a million times or another in their life really come under some self-sabotaging behavior that was really undermining our values, our goals, our dreams, our visions, and our true authentic potentiality for ourselves? Basically, it's just stopping us from being the person that we came to be and enjoying that experience of being that person. So self-sabotaging could come in the form of, say, procrastination. It's definitely how I've been self-sabotaging just in the last couple of weeks. It's also been very hectic astrology, and I did actually a post on Instagram, and so many people resonated with it through the comments and through the DMs I got about this post, that I was saying like, the energy right now just feels like I'm moving through honey. It's just so thick and lethargic, and I can't really see a way through, and things aren't really flowing. They're just kind of oozy and thick. And that's how I felt. Like I kind of felt like I was procrastinating. You could be maybe really impulsive, making decisions that aren't thought through, and just jumping onto things. I see this a lot with people when their shadow is stuck in the things like insecurity especially, or fear. So when their shadow is coming up going, I'm fearful of being alone, I'm fearful of being broke, I'm fearful of this, I'm fearful of that. Impulsivity is such a huge self-sabotaging behavior when the shadow is running the show, because it's like they just quickly have to fix it. It's like the quick fix. It's the, I'll just do this, it'll make it feel better. Because again, like I said at the beginning, we're not really taught and given that safe space to sit with the uncomfortability of the pain that we might be feeling. So we impulsively try to quickly move it on. And I think that's the gift of shadow work that I've definitely received over the years of doing it. Firstly, in a safe space with a healer, but then now, because I've got the tools and I've done shadow work for 15 years, I can actually hold myself through it. And if I feel like it's really heavy and I feel like it's like too much, I can also reach out to other people to help me hold through, shedding a light on the shadow and just meeting it and ultimately asking what it needs. You could also be self-sabotaging by engaging in harmful activities as a way to cope with what hasn't been addressed. So this is where things like overconsumption of substances or food or whatever it is can come in. Shopping, any kind of, I don't want to say addictive behaviors, because I think addiction is way out of my wheelhouse and it's not really something I understand to a level that I could speak about it here. But we can all do it at some point, overeat or overrest or be overactive, whatever it is, self-sabotaging, because we're not aligned with the greatest version of ourselves because we're too busy trying to avoid the shadow. Another aspect, and this has definitely come up for me, is limiting beliefs. So really forming these deeply seated beliefs about ourselves So like I said in my journey, like that the shadow believes to be true. Like the shadow is convinced, and then we can become convinced. Beliefs like, I'm not worthy, or I'll never succeed, or it's not going to happen for me. I'm not good enough. I'm not attractive enough. Whatever those deep beliefs are, I personally have found they've often originated deep within what the shadow is holding. And what happens when we start to believe that is that we're really sabotaging, but also putting a very big block in front of pursuing the things that we know are authentically aligned with us, such as the relationships, the careers, the goals, whatever it is, because the shadow is trying to keep us safe. To say, if you go after this, if you go after love again, you're likely to be hurt. Do not do it. Or the shadow will seek to prove what it knows to be true. So you are not worthy of love. You're probably going to then, therefore, look for subconsciously a lot of rejection. And that brings me to another aspect of how to know if your shadow is running the show, by looking for repeated patterns in your life, because this is what the shadow is looking for, purely because it's familiar with it. We may want to change it. The shadow doesn't want to necessarily do this. This part of ourselves doesn't want to do it. But it's like literally better the devil you know. And not that I want to demonize the shadow, but better the darkness, or better the pain that you know, than to really open yourself up to experience, perhaps, as perceived by the shadow, another essence of pain. So for example, you might be repeatedly choosing partners that are emotionally unavailable to reinforce the fact that you are unlovable. You might be mirroring childhood situations in your life, maybe with friends, or rejection because of what you experienced. That's like, you just go to what you know. And one of the last aspects is emotional, one of the second last, the emotional reactivity, which is also related to this fear of really embracing all of who we are. So when your shadow self is running the show, you may be reacting emotionally without considering, really the situation, because you're quick to bite, you're quick to protect yourself. It could be like conflicts, misunderstandings, or missed opportunities because you're not really communicating effectively with the people that are trying to communicate with you, because you're coming at it from the shadow's perspective. You're only listening for the things that it's protecting itself against. Classic example of this is feedback. Notoriously hard to take is feedback, because often we're listening to the feedback to hear the things that we're trying to hide or protect ourselves from. It's almost like we're looking to see if the other person has seen the big things that we can see within ourselves, and we're working so hard to mask or to hide. And when we look at psychology approaches to help with feedback, a lot of people will talk about growth mindset. And really, I believe growth mindset is just about saying, hey, yeah, I have shadow and I have light, or I have strengths. And my growth mindset is to say, let's look at maybe the things that I'm not that good at and use it as an opportunity to become more. And that's really all shadow work is. It's not done in that clinical way. It's done on a very deep subconscious internal level. But that to me feels like the PG version of it. Because ultimately the shadow is really afraid of being your whole complete self, embracing the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the more glamorous truths about ourselves. And the fear of facing the uncomfortable parts of ourselves or the undesirable parts of ourselves means that we actually really resist healing it and growing from it. And that therefore keeps us stuck in the unfulfilling, undesirable patterns of our life. So learning to, people call it integrate the shadow. I just call it meeting the shadow, nurturing the shadow. Unless we learn to do that, it's really going to block our self-development and self-awareness. And so by acknowledging these shadow aspects of ourselves, we can begin to heal and grow and make choices that align with our greatness, our authenticity, as opposed to the parts that we try to avoid. So how do we do that? Well, the big one that I've mentioned over and over, once you've recognized that maybe your shadow self is hindering you at this point in time with any aspect of your life, is shadow work. So shadow work is really going in and exploring the actual shadow self and seeing the shadow self really clearly and embracing it and learning from its very deep and sharp wisdom. The shadow is so wise. The shadow is like massive mama bear energy just trying to protect us, to the point where shadow work is something I love to do because my shadow works 24/7 on overdrive. And so to give it a break, to go in and say, what are you saying? What do you need? Is such a beautiful experience. And I would advise, if you've never done shadow work before, to do it with someone else, because it can be at times a little confronting. So it's nice to be able to unpack that with someone else. I personally do it on the subconscious level, because I think if we did it on the conscious level, we don't go as deep and maybe be able to see all the things that need to be revealed. We're just almost looking at the conscious aspect of it, i.e. what we're prepared to look at or what we're comfortable to look at or what we already know. It's not as if we don't already know that this shadow stuff exists, but we may be surprised by what the shadow has to show us in terms of where it originated or why it's trying to protect us so fiercely against what it is fearing. Mindful practices can be really helpful to really cultivate a relationship with your shadow, because ultimately mindfulness activities, whether that's coloring in, going for a walk, yoga, meditating, whatever it is, it can just help to slow down your nervous system, to calm it, to simmer it a bit, and help you just start to notice, observe thoughts, emotions that are coming up for you without judging them, and allows and teaches you, and you can practice this, just to hold space for your shadow without it being something that's really overwhelming. You might wake up in the morning and just notice you're just feeling really off. You're just not feeling good about yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to fix it. In a culture that's very dedicated to quick fixes and moving through uncomfortability, maybe today you just have to hold that. And you just have to observe how you view the world, how you perceive the world as that part of yourself, someone that isn't feeling adequate or someone that isn't feeling worthy. Just bringing light to that darkness. And of course, a big aspect of shadow work is seeking help from someone that you trust that can help you hold the space. Ultimately, you have to hold the space. Ultimately, you are doing the work. Anyone you have helping you is just there with you, holding your hand through it. But I know how powerful shadow work has been in my experience and in my life. And the fact that I do this all the time and it keeps coming up shows me it's such a beautiful relationship to have with myself, because I'm not afraid of my shadow. In fact, I'm just more curious about it. And I can see very quickly how it is running my show as I did at this full moon in Scorpio. And I take the approach that when I shed light onto the shadow, so the light of awareness, the light of space, the light of acceptance, that's how I feel, or that's how I perceive myself at that time, the light of grace, the light of patience, and ultimately the light of love onto my shadow. There's not this urgency to make it anything other than it is. And there's not this urgency to make it mean anything more than what it is. Just that aspect of self that is trying to protect me against what it is convinced will be painful for me to go through. And then I can begin to really love my shadow for its role. But then also when the timing is right in my life, circumstantially, timeline-wise, I can use the shadow's wisdom to help heal and to help unbecome, and ultimately to help align with what I know or claim or desire to be my true authentic self. I really hope that this little intro to shadow work, if you've never done it before, has helped you maybe understand a little bit about what may be going on within you in this part of your psyche, and cracked open maybe that little bit of light that we can shine in to see where it is that we really can hold ourselves and love ourselves even more deeply. Next week on the show, we're talking to Dana, so that will be so beautiful to talk about the nervous system and really how that can be an indicator that we're living in a lot of our shadow. But as always, would love to hear your thoughts on all our platforms. If you want help with shadow work, of course, reach out, book in a healing appointment with me, and we can definitely, explore this together. But for now, as always, just sending you so much love and light.